Before colonial contact, Paiute people were master hunter-gatherers. Living in small and mid-sized groups, Paiutes would move across the landscape with the seasons. In warmer summer months, low and high elevation gathering and hunting was rewarding. In cold winter months, low elevation regions were more appealing as food reserves were utilized. Paiute territories included Southern California, Southern Nevada, Northern Arizona, and Southern Utah. Like most cultures throughout time and space, Paiute people experience calm times and occasional conflicts with neighboring tribes. In calm times, celebrations by the sharing of foods, religious belief systems, and communal gatherings occurred. However, significant conflicts are still remembered and documented in modernity. To this day, Paiutes clearly remember Spanish settlement. Spanish settlement of the American Southwest brought violence and resistance to Southern Paiutes. Because Paiutes did not adapt the horse like tribes in the plains did, this made them vulnerable to raids and slave trafficking by Spanish immigrants. Even with the atrocity of Spanish encroachment, it wasn't until the mid-1800s when Paiutes encountered white settlement on their lands. By 1851, members of the LDS Church began settlements on Paiute land, and by 1859, 11 Mormon settlements were established in Southern Paiute territory. Initially, Paiute people welcomed Mormon settlers as they offered protection against raiding Utes, Navajos, and Mexican groups. Unfortunately, as relations grew closer, so did disease and epidemic. The first Paiute reservation was established in 1891 on the Santa Clara River, and later 3 others were added. All of these reservations were scarce in resources and too small to sustain life. Through broken agreements, hard-fought resolutions, and eventually the restoration of federal recognition, today southern and northern bands of Paiute people inhabit over 800,000 acres of land over multiple states. And while reservations often lack the resources and economic stability that native tribes need, ultimately people of all walks of life are free to live and succeed as they see fit. Many Paiutes have left the reservation life, but those who continue to stay on reservations often find creative ways to get by and make a decent living. For example, in Nevada, Paiute people have invested heavily in the medical marijuana industry. While some see controversy, bringing large grow farms and Paiute lands has brought much needed economic stability and growth to this reservation. In a 2016 Weed Etiquette documentary by Vice, the struggles of Paiute people were clearly visible. After contracting with UltraHealth and building an 84,000 square foot dispensary, the Nevada reservation has seen greater economic opportunity for those struggling financially. So one thing that has always fascinated me beyond the cultural and anthropological aspect of the Paiute people are the material remains, the material culture, meaning the items that they created and have survived the test of time. These items are still practiced in modernity and carried on from generation to generation in descendant communities. So my focus of research has strictly been quite focused on the archery equipment, the bows, arrows, quivers, and projectile points of the Paiute people from the early 1800s throughout the 1900s. These bows are nothing short of remarkable. They're extremely well made. They're fascinating. They're short in profile and design, as fast as you can get out, and just about practical for any environment and locale. So in today's video, I want to take you step by step in recreating the Paiute bow. So right beside me, we have what the locals call red cedar or eastern red cedar. This is a younger example. In the tree line behind me and the tree line in front of me, we have much larger trees, which this will grow to be much, much larger, with nice long limb sections. So I can see some of the cedars in front of me with longer limbs that we'll be harvesting to make our Paiute style bow and let it season for a few months. So when I looked at this eastern red cedar, I really questioned the validity of it being a true cedar. It shares more the common characteristics of juniper rather than a true cedar. So I contacted a friend and colleague who runs a company called Health Primitive. She's a renowned botanist. Her name is Casey. And she did in fact confirm what the locals refer to as red cedar or eastern red cedar as a true juniper species. So we will be using juniper to construct this bow, or what is commonly referred to as, once again, eastern red cedar. So I'm going to walk this tree line behind and in front of me and look for a nice long section to construct this Paiute style bow. All right, so here is my eastern red cedar stave. You can see it's a nice short profile, so this will be a short design bow. Now, as we take a look at this stave, you can see the sapwood to heartwood ratio is completely different. We have much more heartwood than we have sapwood. Now, typically speaking, with eastern red cedar, it's always good to have a wider bow, but also more sapwood on the belly side. And the reason is this sapwood is much more compression resilient compared to the heartwood, meaning if there's an error or a slight error in the tiller, it's less prone to crystallization, whereas this heartwood does tend to crystallize. But again, the way that we offset that is a nice balanced and elliptical tiller, which we always strive for, whether it's a long bow or a shorter design bow. So this bow stave is a little bit wider towards this end. Up towards the top, it gets a little bit narrower, but that's where my tips will pinch in. This is 1.5 inches, and then as we flip the stave over, this is a little over 2 inches wide. So we are going to utilize the width of this stave, but you can see this stave has a lacquer coating on the ends and on the back. You can see that right here, that shiny lacquer coating. We need to remove that to establish the back of this bow and the back of the stave. The reason we put lacquer on the back of the bow and on the ends is so when we harvest it and it dries out, it's less prone to splitting and checking. So we'll put it on the vise and start removing this back layer. All Sinew back bows do not require the maker to establish a single growth ring on the back of the stave. Slowly removing small amounts of material without gouging the wood is still critically important even when making a Sinew back bow. All right, so take a look. We have the back of this stave established. I completely removed that lacquer coating, and one way to tell if the lacquer is completely gone or any sealant is to smell the back of the bow. If it smells like lacquer or chemical, you need to continue to work on getting underneath that coating. So before we start removing belly wood off of this stave, I want to show you what I got going on here. So I did lay out the back of this bow, and we laid out the shape and design of it, so the profile of this bow. What I've done is I took my measurement. This is a 44-inch stave, and I divide that by 2. That becomes my center mark at 22 inches. Then from that center mark, I measure 2 inches on each side. That is my handle area, and I find 1.25 inches wide in 2-inch increments. So you can see here I have horizontal marks every 2 inches on both sides of the stave on both limbs, and I measure 1.25 inches off of a center line. So I establish a center line off of this stave. So that becomes the width, 1.25 inches, and then I go up to each tip. So off of that center line, I measure 1/4 inch on one side and 1/4 inch on the other, on both limbs, on both tips, and I make a mark. That's a 1/2 inch tip, and I just trace it to the edge. So I find 6 inches, I make a horizontal mark. So you can see I have that horizontal mark at 6 inches, and again I trace that line right to the edge. That becomes the layout of this particular bow. Very easy and simplistic. Now let's take this stave to the workbench, start removing belly mass, and follow this measurement system. Let's get this stave looking like a bow. Yeah, everything's looking really good here. I can't believe how nice this piece of wood is. I've got it shaped, profiled, and as you can see, I removed a lot of that belly mass using the draw knife. So at this point, I'm going to set the draw knife aside and transition into the Shinto rasp. The Shinto rasp is nice because it has this hacksaw blade-like configuration where we have an aggressive side and a not so aggressive side. And as I mentioned, Eastern red cedar is a very, very soft wood. It's almost as soft as willow. So I'm going to use this not so aggressive side in achieving a floor tiller, meaning we're going to remove more belly mass and more wood on this belly side. When we put the limb on the ground, I want to see a nice even bend on both limbs. So we are going to continue to work on this project, transitioning into the Shinto rasp, and then finishing it off with an 80 grit piece of sandpaper. Like I said, once these limbs really start to bend. There's a little bit of bounce in them right now, but we've got a ways to go. So let's get started. After both limbs are bending evenly, the tips are boiled in a pot of water over the fire, and recurves are slowly bent into place. Yeah, look at that. These tips are nice and even, nice and straight, no twist whatsoever. Looking great. It's starting to look like a bow. I also took dry heat and set these recurves into place. The bow is flexing a little bit. So I'm calling it. It is now time to move forward and laminate the back of this bow with sinew. I want to take you through that entire process from start to finish. So here is one of 4 legs on a deer that I took, and this deer is very, very healthy, in great shape, and I am going to show you how to cut the sinew out of this deer leg. So we'll just separate that hide. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. You just want to start separating the hide from that tendon. Now the back legs are much easier to work with. There's more surface area. The front legs can get a little bit tricky, but once you open up the hide, just like here, you can see I have an opening. I'm just peeling it back. Once again, this is really, really important to have a nice sharp knife. This hide can get a little bit stiff, and depending on how long it's sat out, it can be tough to work with. So a good sharp knife is a safe knife. And you can see I'm just peeling that skin back, just like I'm filleting the animal and removing its hide. That's exactly what I'm doing. Just peeling that animal hide back. All right, so then we have the tendon, and you can feel it. So that's where the tendon is at. So I'll poke my knife down in between the bone and the tendon. And I'm just going to cut that sinew out, fall it right to the end. So you can see where that saw mark is at the bone. And I just cut it out. And I just fall that back. And you can see, just following it back, a little bit of cartilage in there. And now I separate the tendon from the leg. That's a little bit of cartilage right there. I'll just cut that out. And there's my sinew. Sinew backing a bow adds strength and stability. While wood bows without a backing can be bent quite drastically, sinew stretches 8 times more than wood grain. Thus, adding sinew to the back of a short bow allows a shooter to bend the limbs back much farther. And while many wood species do not require a sinew backing, others such as juniper should be backed when higher draw weights are desired. Simply put, juniper can become very brittle without a sinew backing. After the sinew is processed and soaked in water, a double-layered backing is laminated to the back of the bow. Each bundle of sinew is submerged in warm hide glue and staggered like brickwork. This ensures a secure lamination free of any thin spots. As the sinew dries and cures, the bow will naturally pull into reflex. With heavier layers of sinew, reflex can become quite extreme. Some Paiute bows housed in the Smithsonian Museum have 8 inches or more of reflex. Surely these bows were built for high performance. Okay, it has been a few months since we sinew back this bow, and you can see the reflex looks nice and even. It is just about as perfect as I can get. So it is now time, because this bow is dry and cured, to start the final tillering process. And the way I go about this final tiller with a piece of juniper, or what's called Eastern red cedar, is I use a piece of sandpaper. This is 60 grit sandpaper. I want to work very slow because this is such a soft wood. When I run my thumbnail on this belly side, you can visibly see a slight indentation with how soft this wood is. So again, we want to work slow and steady. A rasp is far too aggressive. Same thing with a file, and that's why I choose sandpaper. The areas that I'm focusing at is right in this handle area, through the fades and into the limbs. So I stop at the tips. Remember, these tips will remain static, meaning non-bending. So I'm going to have a static recurve tip where these tips do not bend, but my bending area is going to be right outside of the tips throughout the handle, a nice circular profile. So we'll get started again with this piece of sandpaper and just go slow. Even with 60 grit sandpaper, you can very easily remove too much too fast. So it's really important, again, with this Eastern red cedar, these juniper species, to work slow. Well, as you can see, I've got the bow on a tillering stick behind me. I've been working on this for the past few days, and it might look sunny outside, but it is frigid. Last night it got down to -2. The polar vortex is starting to sweep in. Over the next few days, we are expected to get quite a bit of snow. So I'm going to work on this project as long as I can, ride out the snowstorm, and then get right back to it. So what I want to do is I want to train these limbs to flex and bend. With a sinew back bow, and especially a highly reflex sinew back bow, it can be quite deceptive, meaning the weight can feel a lot heavier than it actually is. And a way to start easing into stringing up the bow and getting that higher weight is to train these limbs to bend. So what I'll do is I'll pull it on this tillering stick over and over again, training these limbs once again to bend, and then slowly removing wood on that belly side, just repeating that process until I can get it up to brace height. Another thing to keep in mind with a conifer species, whether it's juniper or yew wood, any soft wood, just make sure conditions are ideal. Today it's not really ideal because once again it is very, very cold outside, and even though this bow is sinew backed, the wood can still become very brittle and it can easily break in frigid cold temperatures. So the best time to tiller and shoot these bows are spring and summertime, when it's a little bit warmer and there's more moisture and humidity in the atmosphere. But nonetheless, we will start bending this piece of wood, training both of the limbs to bend, and we will continue tillering. Okay, so we are strung up at full brace height too. It doesn't look too bad. I'm noticing a few areas, so right in here, it's a little bit stiff. Same thing with this outer limb. I want to avoid the mid limbs and then maybe remove a little bit in the handle. Boy, that's a stout bow. Awesome. So we will continue working, removing mass out here, and then once again throughout this handle area. I want a little bit more bend, and I can feel that too. A little bit stiff in the handle area. Making progress. We'll get back to work. Okay, so I am at a point where it is now time to stop my work. This bend profile looks great. I have a nice circular bend, and that's exactly what my goal was from start to finish, is to get a really good tiller with this challenging profile. A reflexed and recurved bow can be quite tricky. So I'm pleased with everything and how it looks. The final step is to put this bow back on the tillering tree, attach my pulley scale, and let's see what my final draw weight is at 20 inches. I have my scale set to 0. Let's give it a pull. All right. 45 pounds on the dot. That's a great weight for this little bow. After weeks of slowly tillering the bow, the handle and tips are wrapped in strips of smoked brain tan leather. The finished product is a beautiful and exceptionally fast bow, worthy of hunting large game such as elk and deer with. A fast bow is determined by its profile and design. Some of the fastest bows made are short in length. With its short profile, reflexed and recurved tips, and sinew backing, in the end, the Paiute style bow is by far the fastest I've ever shot.